Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show where we dig through stacks of sources, articles, research, and yeah, our own notes too, to pull out those bits of knowledge you need. We try to get you informed, fast, and hopefully keep it interesting. Today, we're tackling an idea that, well, it just sounds wrong at first, doesn't it? The idea of rich peasants in the Middle Ages. I mean, picture a medieval peasant. What pops into your head? Probably someone grinding away, super poor, living under a lord's thumb, right? So the idea that one of them could actually get wealthy, it feels like a total paradox. How could someone basically tied to the land, under all those rules, scrape together anything like riches, especially when there weren't banks like we have or even much cash floating around? It just doesn't fit the usual picture.
It really does sound counterintuitive, absolutely. And that's exactly why diving into this is so, well, fascinating. The popular image often smooths over these really complex economic realities, these surprising little pockets of opportunity that actually existed.
Exactly, and that's what we're doing today. That's our mission. We're going to unpack the tricky, often really tough ways that some peasants did manage to get ahead economically. We want to challenge maybe some of your ideas, redefine what wealth even meant back then, and show you the surprising, sometimes really hard paths people took to, rise above their circumstances. And to do that, we've gathered a pretty serious pile of historical accounts, the latest academic research, economic studies, all sorts of stuff. Think of this as your shortcut to understanding a medieval world that was maybe a lot more dynamic, more complex than you thought. So let's jump in and try to unravel this puzzle.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. If we're talking rich peasants, we absolutely have to rethink what wealth meant in the Middle Ages. It's a totally different way of thinking compared to now, isn't it?
That's exactly the place to start. Yeah.
It wasn't mainly about gold coins or silver, not for most people anyway. Right. And what's really striking is how resilient these other forms of wealth could be, non-monetary wealth, especially in a time that was so prone to disruption, famine, plague, war, constantly. Mm-hmm. Our modern ideas, focusing on cash in the bank or stocks, they just don't really capture what prosperity looked like then. For most folks, especially earlier on, the economy was all tangled up in direct exchanges, favors, customary rights, family ties, actual money, coins, as the main way to measure wealth or build it up. That was mostly for small group financial guys, big city merchants, the absolute top nobility.
Okay, so if a peasant wasn't counting coins, what was their wealth? I know for the nobles, gold and silver often weren't for spending, right? They melted them down into fancy swords or jewelry, prestige objects.
It's exactly.
Yeah.
For the elites, those things weren't just fancy decorations. They had a huge social job to do, a political one too, showing off status, power, influence, and really importantly, passing that status down through generations. Think about it, like an old noble family. Maybe they didn't have much cash flow anymore, but they still got massive respect just because of their name, their history, way more than some merchant who just got rich selling stuff no matter how much gold he had.
Huh. So status wasn't just about money.
Not at all. It shows how social standing, tied up in land and who your ancestors were, often counted for more than just cash. Capital, in that sense, was mostly fixed land or buildings who you knew, not really liquid financial stuff.
Right. So for a peasant, being rich, it wasn't a bank account. It was stuff they could see and touch and use, stuff that helped them survive.
Precisely. For a peasant, rich meant, first off, secure and ideally extensive land tenure. Not just a tiny plot, but enough land to reliably grow extra food year after year. It meant having good productive assets, maybe a strong ox or horse for plowing, a decent plow, maybe a good-sized flock of sheep. Animals were hugely important. And this is critical, it meant having a solid social network, family who'd help in a pinch, neighbors you traded work with, community support if things went bad.
That makes sense, like insurance almost.
Kinda, yeah. This productive and social wealth was often way more durable in those volatile times than a hidden stash of coins. Getting ahead for them wasn't about piling up cash, it was about building up their ability to produce more and making sure they had people to rely on when inevitably things got tough. A prosperous farmer, maybe what we call yeoman later on, they might be quite wealthy in terms of their land and animals. But that didn't automatically mean the nobles suddenly saw them as social equals.
Ah, okay. So there was still that social barrier.
Absolutely. Their economic success could even be seen as a challenge to the old order. That inherited social structure, it was incredibly powerful, incredibly hard to break through, even if you did manage to get wealthy.
That difference is so important, and it leads right into the next point. Peasant wasn't just one thing. It wasn't this single, uniform group of poor farmers. It was a whole spectrum.
Exactly, a whole range of situations.
From serfs who were basically property all the way up to these yeomen and freeholders. And it wasn't always static between those levels either.
Right. And if we look at the bigger picture, this hierarchy, this range, shows us that peasant wasn't a fixed label throughout the Middle Ages. He was dynamic, which brings up a really interesting question. What did being free actually mean back then? And how did that freedom connect to your chances of getting ahead? At the very bottom, especially before the Black Death really shook things up, you had the serfs. They made up maybe half the population in many areas.
Wow.
Yeah, a huge chunk. And they were essentially legally tied to the land. Couldn't leave without permission. Their whole life was basically working to feed themselves and working for the Lord, paying dues, often in crops or animals, sometimes labor. They faced huge restrictions, couldn't move, couldn't marry someone off the manor, couldn't just decide to become a blacksmith. Not without the Lord saying, okay. But, and this is the paradox, they weren't totally without any rights. They had customary rights, often generations old. Things like the Lord's protection, maybe some basic help in old age or if they were sick. A very basic safety net, you could say.
Huh. A safety net, even in that really restricted life. That's surprising.
It was meager, often, but it was something. A protection against utter destitution sometimes. Then, maybe a step up, you had the villeins, maybe 20% of the population before the plague.
Chileans? Okay.
They were typically tenant farmers, maybe sharecroppers, usually paid their rent in crops. Technically, they were considered freer than serfs on paper.
But only on paper.
Often, yeah. In practice, they were often just as tied down, though maybe with slightly more defined rights, fewer personal arbitrary demands from the Lord. Then you had a more varied group, farmers, free men, generally a bit better off. Some of them might even own small farms outright. They definitely had more freedom, could move if they wanted, make more of their own choices. But the really big jump in terms of actual prosperity and maybe climbing the social ladder a bit came with the yeomen and the franklins.
Right. These were the free commoners who owned and worked their own lands. And you mentioned in the sources this was a very big deal. Why was owning your own land so transformative?
It was huge.
Yeah.
Because these were the people who really started to bridge that gap between the nobility and just the general workforce. They managed to become self-sufficient. And crucially, they consistently produced more than they needed as surplus, which they could then sell at market. They even paid taxes directly to the king or the state, not just feudal dues to a lord. That set them apart.
So they were contributing directly to the kingdom's finances.
Exactly. And their land holdings could vary a lot. Some had just enough to be independent, others had pretty large, successful farms. We start seeing them formally recognized as a distinct group, like in England around the mid-14th century. It shows they were becoming economically important. And alongside them, you also had the burghers.
Ah, the town dwellers.
Right, maybe 17% of the population combined with the yeomen. These were free men living in towns and cities, didn't necessarily own farmland, but they were busy with trades, crafts, being merchants. Their wealth came from business, from the urban economy, not directly from the soil. Another path away from just farming.
So moving up from serf to yeoman, that was a major shift. The whole question of peasants getting rich is really about, could you actually break out of the status you were born into?
Precisely. Could you transcend your birth?
But there's that twist you mentioned, that paradox, the idea that being free could actually be more dangerous, like walking a tightrope.
And here's where it gets really interesting. It pushes back against how we usually think about freedom being automatically better. A poor yeoman, okay, he's free. He doesn't have a lord breathing down his neck for labor service.
Sounds good so far.
Right. But he also lacks that meager safety net that serfdom, ironically, sometimes provided. No guaranteed protection from the Lord if the harvest failed completely. There's a quote somewhere describing them as one bad harvest away from total ruin. And that captures it perfectly.
Wow. So freedom meant more risk.
Exactly. Real economic freedom meant being directly exposed to market swings, to bad weather, disease, all the dangers of medieval life, but without that basic backstop. So a rich peasant wasn't just someone with more land. They were someone who successfully managed all that extra risk. They had to be smart, maybe lucky to navigate that precariousness that came with independence.
It wasn't just about getting free, it was about surviving freedom.
You got it. It required real skill, real foresight.
Okay, so how did any of these peasants, even the yeomen, start building that wealth? It must have started quite literally in the ground beneath their feet.
Well, that's where this medieval agricultural revolution comes in, roughly between, say, 800 and 1300 AD. It wasn't just about a few new gadgets. It really fundamentally changed how much food could be grown. This made generating wealth, actual surplus wealth, beyond just scraping by, a real possibility for many people who'd only ever known subsistence farming. It was this increase in food production that really powered the growth of towns, markets, and the overall population during that time.
Okay, so what were these big innovations? What actually changed in the fields that made such a difference for, potentially getting ahead?
Several key things came together. A big one was the wider use of the moldboard plow.
The moldboard plow.
Yeah, this was a heavier plow, usually with a metal share that could cut deeper into the soil and, crucially, turn it over. This is huge for aerating the soil, improving drainage, especially in the heavier, wetter soils of northern Europe.
So better soil means better crops.
It's exactly. More fertile land, higher yield per acre, often with less repeated effort. For a peasant, that directly translates into more grain, potentially surplus grain. Then there was the more systematic use of crop rotation, especially the three-field system becoming common.
Instead of just letting half the land rest each year.
Right. With the three-field system, you'd only leave about a third fallow. One third might have wheat or rye planted in the autumn. Another third could have oats, barley, or legumes like peas and beans planted in the spring. This meant 2/3 of the land was productive each year, not just half. It increased output significantly and also gave a more varied harvest, which was good for soil health and for spreading risk. If one crop did poorly, maybe the others did okay.
Makes sense. Diversification, even then.
Absolutely. And then better ways to harness animal power. The horse collar became more widespread.
Replacing the old yoke.
Yeah, the traditional yoke worked okay for oxen, but it tended to choke horses when they pulled heavy loads. The new horse collar rested on the horse's shoulders, letting them pull much more weight, faster, and for longer.
So faster plowing?
Faster plowing and also more efficient hauling of wagons, which ties into another improvement. Better wagon axles. Seems small, but smoother running wagons meant you could transport more goods further with less effort and maybe less spoilage, crucial for getting surplus to market. In places like England, you really see this serialization happening, huge areas turning primarily to grain production. This created substantial surpluses that could feed growing towns or even be exported.
It sounds like a pretty clever system, really, for the technology they had.
It really was.
Yeah.
Especially the open field system with its rotation. It was generally low input and land extensive.
Low input, meaning they didn't need tons of fertilizer.
Right. Soil fertility was mainly kept up by those fallow periods. And crucially, during the fallow time, villagers often had rights to graze their animals, sheep, cattle on that land.
Ah, free manure.
Exactly. Natural fertilization. So a smart peasant, managing their grazing rights well, could keep their strips of land fertile without having to spend scarce cash or a lot of labor hauling manure. That directly boosted their net yield, their potential surplus. And alongside these field improvements, you also saw more investment in things like centralized grain drying facilities, malting ovens for beer, water mills for grinding grain, big barns for storage, often on monastic lands or large manors.
So processing and storage grow better, too.
Which was vital. You have to be able to store a surplus if it's going to translate into wealth. All these things together, better tools, better methods, better infrastructure, they made surplus generation possible. And that surplus was the absolute starting point for any peasant getting richer. Without growing more than you ate or paid in dues, forget it.
Okay, so this agricultural revolution increased the overall pie, so to speak. But you mentioned it wasn't necessarily shared equally. It sounds like it might have actually made the gap between rich and poor peasants wider in some ways.
That's a really important point, yes.
Yeah.
There was a definite duality to it. On one hand, yes, more food supported more people, more trade. But the efficiency gains, especially in large-scale grain farming, also led to increasing wealth disparities. Landowners' lords, monasteries who controlled large areas could really benefit. They could amass and mobilize wealth by exploiting the labor of others on a bigger, more organized scale because the land itself was more productive. They could demand higher rents or more output.
So the rich got richer, basically.
In many cases, yes. But at the same time, these changes absolutely created openings for some peasants to climb up. We see evidence of what were called upwardly mobile churls in England, for example.
Churls, those were the free farmers, right?
Generally, yes.
Yeah.
Free peasants, maybe owning some land.
Yeah.
Some of these guys, through using the new techniques effectively or maybe getting lucky with good land or making smart deals, they managed to acquire enough land and wealth to actually achieve the Ehrenly status.
The Ehrenly status. So moving into the lower ranks of the aristocracy.
Essentially, yes. A significant step up. It shows that while the system could allow lords to extract more, it also gave savvy individuals a chance to break out. to use those same innovations for their own benefit. It made rural society more complex, more layered than just lord and serf.
Fascinating. So, okay, they're growing more stuff. How did they turn that extra grain or wool or whatever into actual economic gain? They had to sell it somewhere.
Exactly. And this really flies in the face of the old idea that peasants only farmed to feed themselves. They were actively producing for the market, using their agricultural output to get ahead economically, plugging into wider trade networks.
What kind of stuff were they selling beyond just grain?
Oh, a whole range of things. Consistently, you see peasants selling surplus poultry chickens, geese plus eggs, butter, cheese, vegetables from their garden plots. Women were often key players here.
The small stuff, but it adds up.
It really did. Think about market day. A woman brings in a basket of eggs, a small cheese she made, sells it for a few coins. Those coins could buy salt, maybe a new pot, things they couldn't easily make themselves. And ale. Peasant women often earned a significant income, sometimes their main income from brewing, by turning surplus grain into ale and either selling it directly from their homes, like temporary pubs, or selling it to taverns.
Ale brewing as a major income source, that's interesting.
Definitely. Beyond food and drink, they also grew specific industrial crops, things like flax and hemp for making linen cloth and rope, or plants used for dyes, woad for blue, madder for red, grown in small plots specifically to be sold, and wool. Wool was huge, incredibly valuable. The sources suggest something like at least 2/3 of wool for export across Europe came not just from big monastic estates, but from the flocks owned by ordinary peasants.
2/3. That's enormous. So they were deeply involved in international trade, even at that level.
Absolutely, directly or indirectly, their wool was feeding the massive textile industries in places like Flanders and Italy.
So, were there specific hotspots, regions where peasants really seemed to cash in on this market trade?
Yes, definitely. Regional specialization became quite pronounced. Peasants in, say, Picardy and the Ile-de-France area in northern France, they got wealthy trading grain, good fertile land, good river access to ship it south, often ending up in northern Italian cities via the big champagne fairs. Down near Dijon and Montpellier, it was wine. Peasants capitalized on the climate, grew grapes, made wine, and shipped that off, again, often to Italy. Cahors in southern France became famous for the dye trade. Wealthy merchants, but also the peasants growing the dye plants, benefited. Over in the Holy Roman Empire, you had different specializations. Around the Baltic Sea, grain was key. Cologne area famous for wine. Frisian farmers up north, they got rich raising livestock, driving herds sometimes long distances to market.
And England, you mentioned wool and dyes earlier.
Yeah, especially areas around Cambridge, Lincoln, York. Farmers there accumulated quite a bit of wealth from wool, and also the dye plants that went with it, often dealing directly with merchants from Flanders or Italy who came to buy.
It sounds like they were pretty savvy, plugging into these opportunities. But it wasn't just about having the right crops, was it? There must have been other things helping them succeed, like good roads or ways to handle the money.
You're exactly right. Success wasn't just individual effort. It was often linked to the surrounding infrastructure and even early financial systems. These prosperous regions often had good infrastructure. Think navigable rivers, reasonably well-kept roads, maybe sturdy bridges, things that cut the cost and risk of moving goods.
Made it easier to get to market.
Way easier. And they often had access to, well, early forms of banking. Groups like the Knights Templar and the Hospitallers handled large sums of money. Big merchant families like the Fuggers in Germany started setting up branches. Even places like Cahors had quite sophisticated credit systems. These groups could help finance trade, transfer money safely over long distances, which was vital for international commerce.
So early banking helped grease the wheels.
Definitely. Plus, having enough actual currency around from local mints helped make transactions smoother. And another small but important thing, market tolls were often quite low, usually less than 1%. Sometimes small goods were exempt entirely. This really encouraged peasants to participate, made it worthwhile even to bring small amounts of surplus to sell. It all paints a picture of a much more commercially active countryside than we usually imagine.
Yeah, it really does. And beyond selling what they grew, many peasants found other ways to bring in income, didn't they, back at home?
Absolutely. And that's where cottage industries became so important. It wasn't just about farming, it was about having a diversified household economy. This really highlights how raw materials, sometimes from their own land or the local woods, fed into bigger industries, often in towns. It created this really valuable kind of symbiotic link.
So they were like mini entrepreneurs in their own homes, using the downtime from farming.
Exactly. Especially during the winter or other slow agricultural periods, it was a smart strategy to bring in extra income and, crucially, to reduce the risk of relying only on the harvest.
Makes sense. What kind of things were they doing? What did these home industries look like?
A huge amount of it was textile related. Weaving wool into cloth was incredibly common, often done right in the peasant's cottage. For many families, especially if their landholding was small or not very fertile, doing this additional work trades to survive wasn't just a bonus, it was essential. They also did things like making charcoal, which was needed for blacksmiths and heating, chopping lumber for building or firewood, sometimes working seasonally in local quarries, digging stone, especially common in winter when there wasn't much field work. And villages often had their own skilled specialists too. The blacksmith, obviously vital for tools and horseshoes, carpenters for building and repairs, weavers, fullers who processed the cloth, tanners working with leather. These guys earned their living from their craft, and the sources emphasize these weren't always tiny operations. They were often far larger and more organized than the master and single apprentice stereotype. Think family businesses, maybe involving several households working together.
Right, not just one guy hammering away alone. And women were central to this too, weren't they? Especially in textiles.
Absolutely central. Spinning wool or flax into thread was a near universal task for women, and they often earned money doing it, supplying thread to local weavers or even merchants organizing larger scale production. It's a vital part of the household income that often gets overlooked.
And the ale brewing you mentioned earlier fits here too.
Perfectly. It was a major cottage industry run primarily by women, turning surplus grain into a valuable saleable commodity. Some villages even got known for specific crafts, maybe high-quality pottery, with several families specializing. This widespread engagement in non-farming work shows a really sophisticated approach by peasant households, supplementing income, diversifying, managing risk. It provided that essential buffer against a bad harvest or other misfortunes.
And all this activity, buying and selling, brewing, crafting, it points towards another massive change, right? The slow but steady growth of a money economy, moving away from just bartering goods. That must have opened up huge new possibilities.
Oh, absolutely fundamental. This shift from an economy based mostly on exchanging goods and labor, directly paying your rent in chickens or days worked, to one where cash played a much bigger role. It was a game changer. It really boosted peasants' economic agency.
How so? What did using money allow them to do?
Well, money gives you flexibility, doesn't it? You can save it more easily than saving grain, which can spoil. You can use it to buy exactly what you need from a wider range of people and places. It just makes transactions more efficient. While the early medieval period involved a lot of barter, the evidence is clear that by the high Middle Ages, everyone from the king down to the humblest peasant used coins and reckoned in terms of units of money.
Everyone, even the poorest.
Increasingly so, yes. Maybe small amounts, but they were part of that system. And this trend towards monetization was growing significantly from around the 11th century up to the mid-14th century. At first, maybe only financial specialists handled big sums, but coins gradually filtered down through society.
What pushed this change? Was it just that money was easier, or were there bigger forces at play?
Convenience was part of it, sure, but there were several big drivers. One was simply the growth of towns and cities. Urban centers naturally fostered market economies where stuff was bought and sold for cash. This created a demand for peasant surpluses, which they could then sell for coin. Merchants played a key role here too, acting as the link, moving goods from countryside to town and facilitating this cash-based trade.
Okay, so towns needed food, peasants sold it for cash.
Right. Another huge factor was that landlords themselves increasingly wanted cash rents instead of labor or goods.
Why the change? Wasn't free labor good for them?
Sometimes, but labor could be unreliable, grudging, as the sources say, and cash was more flexible. A lord could use cash to buy luxury goods from faraway silks, spices, wine, which were becoming more desirable. You can easily buy silk from Italy with a peasant's week of plowing.
Ha! Good point.
So this landlord, demand for cash, forced peasants to sell their surplus in market towns just to pay their rent. It actively pushed them into the money economy. And interestingly, even changes in church law played a part. Gradually, the rules around lending money at interest, usury, were relaxed somewhat, especially with the need to finance huge things like the Crusades. This spurred new financial techniques, ways of handling credit, accounting, made money lending more acceptable, increased the overall money supply.
Wow, even the Crusades influenced peasant economics.
Indirectly, yes. It all fed into this growing use of money, making peasant economies more complex, more interconnected.
So, money wasn't just about buying things, it actually shifted the power dynamic a bit, gave peasants more leverage.
Exactly. It moved things away from just fixed traditional obligations towards something more like supply and demand. As markets grew and cash became king, the value of what peasants produced, or their labor, started to be set by market forces. So, if demand for grain was high, or if labor suddenly became scarce, and we'll definitely get to that with the Black Death, peasants could actually command better prices or higher wages.
They could negotiate.
More effectively, yes. They had more power to negotiate the terms of their rent, the price of their surplus, or the wages for their work. Imagine a lord desperate for harvest workers facing peasants demanding cash wages. It changes everything. It allowed some peasants to accumulate wealth simply by playing the market smartly, leveraging their position. It slowly turned that old feudal relationship based on personal service into something more like a contract, more economic. A huge, slow-motion revolution.
And speaking of leverage and revolution, sometimes the biggest shifts, the most dramatic changes in who had the power, came not from slow evolution, but from sudden, massive, and utterly tragic events.
You're absolutely right. And this next event, while horrific in terms of human cost, undeniably acted as a massive catalyst. It created opportunities for social and economic change on a scale that was previously unimaginable. It's a stark, brutal lesson in how huge demographic shocks can reshape societies from the bottom up. We're talking, of course, about the Black Death.
Mid-14th century, the scale of it is just staggering to think about, even now. The immediate impact must have been pure chaos.
Catastrophic is barely the word. It swept across Europe between roughly 1347 and 1351, killing, estimates vary, but maybe 30% to 50% of the entire population in just a few years.
Half the population gone.
In some areas, yes, maybe even more. This created an immediate continent-wide severe shortage of labor. Suddenly, there weren't enough farm workers, not enough artisans, not enough servants, not enough people to do the work that needed doing. Think about villages nearly wiped out, fields left unplowed because there was no one to do it. Sources even talk about nobles, people who never dream of manual labor, having to get out there and help with the harvest just to have enough food.
Wow, a total reversal of the norm.
Completely. And this dramatic, sudden shift in the labor-to-land ratio, suddenly lots of land. Very few workers gave the surviving peasants incredible leverage. Unprecedented leverage.
Because their labor was suddenly in high demand.
Extremely high demand. They could demand much higher wages for their work. And crucially, they were in a much stronger position to shift away from paying rent with labor or crops and towards paying fixed money rents instead, which they now had a better chance of earning through those higher wages.
So they could effectively buy their freedom from those old labor duties. But the nobility didn't just roll over and accept this, did they? I remember reading about the Statute of Labourers in England.
No, they definitely pushed back. Their whole world was being turned upside down. The English Parliament, dominated by landowners, passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351. Its main goal was to freeze wages at pre-plague levels.
Trying to turn back the clock?
Exactly. Trying to force peasants back into the old economic box. But this just infuriated the peasants. They saw it, quite rightly, as an attempt to steal their newfound economic advantage, their improved living standards. Yeah. It created huge resentment.
Which boiled over into the Peasants' Revolt, right? 1381.
Precisely. The Peasants' Revolt wasn't just about wages. It was fueled by a whole mix of grievances. Resentment over the wage caps, demands for an end to serfdom, anger about new poll taxes. Figures like Wat Tyler, John Ball, they channeled this deep discontent.
And although the revolt itself is put down.
Brutally suppressed, yes. But it sent a massive shockwave through the ruling class. It showed just how determined peasants were not to go back to the old ways. And in the long run, attempts to rigidly control wages largely failed. More broadly, the continued labor shortages and the peasants' success in demanding higher wages and money rents just made the old manorial system, based on extracting labor, less and less profitable for lords.
It just didn't work economically anymore.
It became much harder to make it work. This significantly sped up the decline of feudalism in the following decades. The whole balance of power between landlord and peasant had fundamentally, irrevocably shifted.
It's just incredible, such a devastating plague causing so much death and suffering, yet it becomes this engine for social and economic change for the survivors. It really speaks to human resilience, finding opportunity even in catastrophe.
It does. The Black Death was the ultimate disruptor. By drastically changing that fundamental ratio of land to labor, it undermined the very foundations of the feudal economy, which relied on plentiful, cheap labor. Peasants gaining the power to demand cash wages and commute their labor services weakened the lord's control and paved the way for a more market-based agriculture. A brutal but undeniable step towards greater peasant autonomy, and for some, a path to greater prosperity.
And that ties directly into the next big shift. You mentioned this move away from working the Lord's land for free, towards just paying a cash rent.
Commutation.
Right.
Exactly. Commutation of labor services. And this was such a crucial step towards peasants having more control over their own lives and economic destinies. It really enabled them to use their time more productively for themselves and engage more with the market. It makes you think, how did this seemingly simple switch from labor to cash actually change the whole social fabric?
From owing service to owing money.
Right. It was a gradual process, but it profoundly changed the relationship. Feudal duties, traditionally paid in work or goods, were increasingly swapped for fixed cash payments. And interestingly, this had advantages for both sides, though different ones.
Okay, so what was in it for the Lords? Why give up free labor?
Well, as we touched on, serf labor wasn't always free in terms of efficiency. Sources talk about it being grudging and unenthusiastic. Peasants working their own land worked harder. Plus, lords increasingly wanted cash.
For those luxury goods again.
Largely, yes. Cash was flexible. You could buy wine, spices, fine cloth, pay mercenaries, things you couldn't get directly from peasant labor. So getting a reliable stream of cash rent became more appealing than managing reluctant workers or dealing with piles of grain.
And for the peasants, what was the upside for them?
Huge upsides. First, clarity. A fixed cash rent was predictable. You knew exactly what you owed. Those old labor services, things like week work, regular days on the Lord's land, and especially boon work extra help demanded at busy times like harvest, could be really elastic. A lord could just demand more.
Ah, so the demands could creep up.
Exactly. A fixed money payment felt much safer, more defined. But even more importantly, it gave them control over their time.
Their most valuable asset, maybe.
Arguably, yes. Instead of spending days working for the Lord, they could use that time on their own plots, making them more productive. Or they could do extra weaving or hire themselves out for wages. It gave them autonomy. This process started slowly, maybe back in the 12th century, but it massively accelerated after the Black Death in the 14th century. By the 16th century, in much of Western Europe, cash rents were the norm. Seeing townspeople gain freedom and prosperity through using money also motivated peasants. They wanted that too.
So what was the result? Did it change the types of peasants we see?
Definitely. Villains, the tenant farmers, largely transitioned into becoming farmers paying money rent, often renting both land and sometimes even livestock, more like modern tenant farmers. And the cotters, those with very small land holdings, often became wage laborers, selling their time to bigger farmers or lords. You start to see the beginnings of a rural working class.
So it wasn't just a tweak. Paying cash instead of working fundamentally changed their economic world.
It was a paradigm shift. Control over their own time meant they could produce more surplus from their own land. Needing cash to pay rent pushed them further into market production and selling. It fostered a more commercial mindset. And crucially, it weakened that direct personal bond of feudal obligation. The relationship became more economic, less personal, less about service tied to land. This erosion of the Lord's direct control over labor was fundamental to the decline of feudalism itself. It shows how changing the economic nuts and bolts can reshape an entire society.
Okay, so we've seen changes in farming, the rise of markets, the impact of the plague, the shift to cash rents. But some peasants found wealth by taking a completely different path, right? Leaving the fields behind entirely and heading for the cities.
Yes, and that lure of the city was powerful. There's that old German proverb, Luft macht frei, city air makes you free, and it really captured a widespread aspiration. For many peasants, especially those stuck in more restrictive feudal situations, moving to a town or city offered a real chance at social mobility, a way out.
City air makes you free. That's such a great line. It makes you wonder how many people actually took that chance, left everything they knew behind for the city. What did that freedom look like in practice?
Well, fundamentally, cities operated under different rules than the countryside. Feudal obligations, being tied to a lord. Those things often didn't apply within the city walls. There was common legal principle. If a peasant managed to live in a city unchallenged by their lord for a year and a day, they often legally became free. They became a burgher, a
A
citizen.
year and a day. That was the magic number.
Often, yes. It varied, but the principle was there. This allowed them to escape serfdom, establish a new life, learn a trade, start a business, without needing a lord's permission. And cities, especially the big wealthy ones like Florence, Milan, Siena, and Italy, were just buzzing with economic activity. It wasn't uncommon for families who'd maybe arrived as poor migrants from the countryside to build up considerable wealth over a generation or two through trade or crafts or providing services.
How did these cities even get started?
Often they grew up around fortifications, castles built in the 9th or 10th centuries for protection. These places attracted people, trade started, markets developed. They became centers not just of commerce, but of learning, culture. You saw the rise of specific commercial districts, the burghs, and this new class of people, the bourgeoisie, whose wealth came from trade and enterprise, not inherited land.
So cities offered a different kind of opportunity structure, based more on what you could do than who you were.
Exactly. Compared to the countryside, where your status was mostly fixed by birth and land, cities were much more fluid. Skill, initiative, business sense, participating in the market, these things could genuinely lead to advancement. That potential for upward mobility, combined with freedom from feudal ties, was a huge draw for rural people looking for a better life. But it wasn't a one-way street. There was this fascinating symbiotic relationship, this interdependence between the city and the countryside.
How so? The cities needed the farms, obviously.
Absolutely. Cities relied completely on their rural surroundings, the hinterland for food, raw materials like wool or timber, even basics like water sometimes. And the constant flow of migrants from the countryside provided the workforce needed for the city's industries, shops, and trade to function and grow. At the same time, the growing demand from the cities for food and raw materials encouraged peasants in the countryside to produce more surplus, to specialize, to become more commercial. Each sector fueled the other's growth. Population movement drove economic development.
So moving to the city was one path, but even staying rural or moving into towns, developing a specific craft or trade was another major way peasants could get ahead, right? Moving beyond farming into skill-based work.
Yes, and this provided that vital buffer against farming risks we talked about, and opened up totally different ways to build wealth. Guilds, especially in the towns, were absolutely key here. They provided a structured way for people, even from poor backgrounds, to gain skills, earn a living, and achieve a certain status.
We mentioned village craftsmen before, blacksmiths, carpenters.
Right? Even in villages, these skilled individuals earned their living through their craft. And as we said, the cottage industries, like weaving, were often much bigger and more organized than just a single master and apprentice, often family-based, sometimes community-wide efforts.
But in the towns, the guilds really formalized things.
They were incredibly important. Guilds essentially controlled much of the urban economy. They set the rules for specific trades who could practice, what standards they had to meet, sometimes even setting prices. This limited competition, but also protected the livelihoods of their members. They offered a clear path for advancement through the apprenticeship system. A young person, often a boy from a peasant family, would become an apprentice to a master craftsman, live with them, learn the trade over several years.
Like an internship almost.
Sort of, yeah, but much more immersive and long-term. After finishing their apprenticeship, they'd become a journeyman, working for wages. And the ultimate goal was to become a master craftsman themselves, join the guild fully, maybe open their own workshop. It was a ladder of advancement based entirely on skill and experience. We also saw that putting out system becoming more common, especially for textiles. Merchants in towns would provide raw wool to peasant families in the countryside, who would spin it and weave it into cloth in their homes. The merchant then collected the finished cloth and sold it.
So homeworking, essentially, organized by merchants.
Exactly. Peasant women, again, were hugely involved in spinning for these systems. And some villages became really well known for a particular craft, like pottery, becoming specialized production centers. All these skill-based activities offered real alternatives to just farming, allowing people to build wealth based on what they could make, not just what they could grow.
Okay, and then there were the real long shots, the extraordinary paths, military service or joining the church. These sound almost like lottery wins, incredibly rare but with life-changing potential.
They were definitely exceptional, often dangerous, but yes, they offered pathways to wealth and status completely outside the usual channels. These institutions acted like alternative ladders, proving that even a system designed to be rigid wasn't completely sealed off for those with extraordinary luck or talent.
Military service, especially during big wars like the 100 Years' War.
Exactly. Warfare could be incredibly profitable, especially for successful mercenary captains, the routiers they were often called. These were essentially private military entrepreneurs, and individuals from quite humble backgrounds could rise spectacularly high.
Do we have examples, real people who made that jump?
Oh yes. Sir John Hawkwood is a famous one.
Yeah.
His father was a landowner, reasonably well off, but definitely not nobility. Hawkwood became one of the most feared and respected mercenary commanders in Italy.
Just through being good at fighting?
And leading. He got incredibly wealthy from contracts, plunder, ransoms. He even married the illegitimate daughter of the Duke of Milan, a huge social leap. His income was said to rival that of entire cities. Think about that.
Incredible. From non-noble beginnings to that level of power and wealth.
Absolutely. Or Sir Robert Knowles, another Englishman, supposedly started as a simple archer and rose to command armies in France, becoming very rich in the process. These are truly amazing stories. They show that military success could essentially let you buy or earn your way into a higher status, bypassing the usual rules of birth.
And the church offered a similar, maybe less violent path.
Definitely less violent, usually. The church was a massive institution, a huge landowner, and a major power structure. And critically, advancement within it was, at least in theory, based more on intellect, piety, or administrative skill than on noble birth. So someone from a very low-born family, if they were smart and capable, could rise through the ranks to positions of immense power and wealth, becoming bishops, abbots, even cardinals, controlling vast resources.
Like Thomas Becket, wasn't he a merchant's son?
Exactly. Became Archbishop of Canterbury, one of the most powerful men in England. Or Cardinal Wolsey, under Henry VIII, came from a very ordinary background, maybe a butcher's son, rose to be Chancellor of England, incredibly wealthy and influential. And this wasn't just a European thing. You see similar patterns elsewhere. Huineng, in 7th century China, supposedly an illiterate peasant, became a foundational figure in Zen Buddhism. Basilai in Byzantium started as a horse tamer and wrestler, ended up founding an imperial dynasty.
Wow, these are truly astonishing stories. It shows that even that incredibly hierarchical world, there were these rare, almost hidden escape routes to the very top.
They were rare, absolutely,
Yeah.
but they existed. These institutions acted as alternative ways up, proving the feudal system wasn't totally locked down for everyone. Exceptional talent, or maybe just being in the right place at the right time, could change everything.
And it's a huge but. For every John Hawkwood or Cardinal Wolsey, there must have been millions who just couldn't escape, who were trapped by the system's built-in limitations.
That's the crucial counterpoint, isn't it? You've hit on the harsh reality. The system itself, the feudal system, was fundamentally structured to extract wealth from peasants, not help them build it. This reality kept the vast majority locked in a cycle of just getting by, limiting any chance for widespread wealth accumulation.
So despite all these pathways we've talked about, the farming innovations, the markets, the cities, even the long shots, most peasants still faced huge roadblocks.
Huge systemic roadblocks. They weren't just random misfortunes. They were baked into the structure of society and the realities of life back then.
And one of the biggest, most constant pressures was just the burden of what they owed, right? Feudal dues, taxes. It must have felt like a constant drain.
Immense and relentless. Think about it. A peasant typically had to give at least 10% of everything they produced, grain, animals, whatever, to their lord as rent or dues.
A lord's cut.
Right. Then on top of that, another 10% usually went to the church as the tithe,
The tithe. Okay, so that's 20% right off the top, potentially.
at least. And that often left them with precious little surplus. Sometimes, after paying dues and setting aside seed for next year, they might barely have enough to feed their family, let alone save or invest. We read accounts of peasants losing all their seed corn, facing starvation. And it wasn't just payments. There was the unpaid labor corvée, labor it's sometimes called, having to work on the Lord's private land, the domain, maybe build roads or bridges or work on church lands, all for free.
Taking time away from their own farms.
Exactly. Time they could have used to grow more for themselves or make things to sell. It directly hampered their own ability to produce a surplus. And there's even evidence, quite disturbingly, that sometimes these burdens were deliberately kept high by the lords and the church precisely to keep peasants dependent, to stop them getting too wealthy, too independent, which might challenge the existing power structure.
Wow. So the system wasn't just indifferent to peasant wealth, it was sometimes actively designed to prevent it.
In many ways, yes. The fundamental purpose of the feudal economy, from the top down, was to channel the surplus produced by peasant labor upwards, to support the lifestyles of the nobility, the knights, the clergy. Peasants got land to live on, and maybe some protection, but the price was steep. Heavy obligations ensured most of the potential profit flowed away from them. It created this cycle of subsistence, or just above subsistence for the majority. Real economic growth, significant savings. Very difficult under those conditions.
And if you happen to be born a serf, especially before the Black Death really changed the game, you were basically stuck. Hard work wouldn't necessarily get you anywhere if you couldn't own land or even leave the manor. That seems like an almost insurmountable wall.
It really does illustrate how the system was built to maintain itself, to keep the social order as it was. Land was the key source of wealth and power, and was concentrated right at the top. So, true independent wealth for most peasants. It was largely out of reach because they simply couldn't get ownership or control of enough land. Before the plague's impact, that social hierarchy was incredibly rigid. Most peasants didn't own land. They worked land owned by lords or the church, paying rent, often in labor. And your status as a peasant, especially a serf, was usually inherited. You were born into it. Very few paths led out.
And for serfs, the biggest group, the restrictions were even tighter, like being economically imprisoned on the manor.
They really were. Legally tied to the land, couldn't leave, couldn't marry outside the manor, couldn't change jobs without the Lord say so. Trying to run away was incredibly risky, harsh punishments if you were caught. This lack of basic freedom, combined with inheriting your status, meant most people were effectively trapped. Didn't matter how hard you worked or how clever you were, the system was designed to keep you in your place. While those exceptions we talked about existed, they were just that, exceptions, not realistic possibilities for the average person.
Okay, so you've got the system draining your surplus, locking you into your social position, and then on top of all of that, there was just the sheer vulnerability of life itself, wasn't there? Famine, disease, war, these could just wipe out anything you had managed to scrape together.
Absolutely. This constant precarity, this vulnerability, is maybe the hardest thing for us to grasp today. Any little bit of progress, any small surplus saved, could vanish overnight. It forced people into a short-term survival mode. Avoiding total disaster often had to take priority over long-term wealth building. It makes you wonder how they even managed risk at all, without modern safety nets or science.
They were living right on the edge.
Constantly.
Yeah.
Medieval farming was incredibly risky. Seed yields varied wildly year to year. Crops could be wiped out by too much rain, not enough rain, floods, frost, pests like locusts or rats, crop diseases, molds.
A million things could go wrong.
Easily. Even in a so-called average year, after paying dues and saving seed, many peasant families were just barely getting enough calories to survive. Malnutrition was common, starvation a constant threat. And then you had the massive disasters. The Great Famine in the early 14th century killed millions in northern Europe. The bovine plague that followed killed off crucial draft animals.
Making it even harder to farm.
Exactly. And the Black Death, while it created opportunities later for survivors, its immediate impact was devastating famine and chaos alongside the disease itself. Plus, don't forget war. Endless wars, as one source put it. Feudal squabbles, peasant uprisings, big conflicts like the 100 Years' War. These brought destruction, requisitioning of food and animals, displacement, more disease, all contributing to population decline at times, economic instability, making it impossible to build lasting security or wealth. This constant vulnerability to shocks, natural, biological, political, meant that even if a peasant family had a few good years, built up a small reserve, it could all be gone in a flash. Without insurance, modern medicine, stable government, they were just incredibly exposed. Sustained enrichment, building real capital over generations. That remained an elusive dream for the vast majority. It really underscores how tough their existence truly was.
So wrapping this all up, looking back from where we are now, what's the takeaway? It really feels like, human resilience, that drive to improve things. It finds ways even when the odds are stacked incredibly high. But wow, it also shows just how incredibly powerful those systemic barriers, the rules, the social structure, the sheer bad luck can be, holding most people back. We kicked this off talking about rich peasants, which sounded like a contradiction, challenging that simple image of medieval life is just uniformly poor and static. And what we've dug into is, well, it's way more complicated, much more nuanced than that, isn't it? We've had to redefine wealth itself, seeing it not just as money, but as land, tools, animals, social connections, real tangible stuff. And we saw that the absolute starting point, the non-negotiable first step for any peasant hoping to get ahead, was figuring out how to produce a surplus, growing more, making more than you needed just to survive and pay your dues.
And this whole deep dive, I think, gives us a really powerful lesson, maybe even a challenge, about how we define wealth today. How our own focus, often so heavily on money, on financial assets, might actually blind us to other forms of well-being, other kinds of capital that might be more resilient than we think. Things like community strength, practical skills, connection to the land, or these maybe forgotten forms of capital, especially when things get unstable. It makes you wonder.
That's a really provocative thought.
And we saw the pathways people took. That agricultural revolution was key: better plows, crop rotation boosting food production. Peasants weren't isolated. They actively plugged into markets, selling grain, wool, wine, ale, crafts, specializing regionally. Cottage industries were vital, diversifying income, providing a buffer. And that slow creep towards a money economy that was fundamental, giving peasants more flexibility, sometimes more bargaining power.
And owning land, becoming a yeoman, that was the dream for many. Then the huge shocks, like the Black Death, tragically creating opportunities by shifting the value of labor, and the commutation of services to cash rents, freeing up peasant time. Plus, those extraordinary escape routes heading to the cities for craft guilds and urban freedom, or the long shots of military fortune or rising through the church.
But, and we have to keep coming back to this, these were often the exceptions. Widespread enrichment was rare. Why? Because the feudal system itself was designed to drain peasant surpluses through rents, tithes, labor. The rigid class structure, especially serfdom, blocked mobility for most, and life was just brutally precarious. Constant vulnerability to famine, disease, war, always threatening to wipe out any gains.
So, the story of the rich peasant isn't about most peasants getting rich. It's about how some managed it against the odds. It's a story of incredible resilience, ingenuity, maybe some luck, navigating a system largely designed to keep them down. It shows peasants weren't just passive victims, they were active agents using innovations, market opportunities, diversification, and sometimes even catastrophic events to try and carve out a better life in a really tough world. A dynamic medieval landscape, not a static one.
It really is a testament to that human drive, isn't it? Finding ways to adapt and even prosper under incredibly difficult constraints.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into how medieval peasants, sometimes against all expectations, managed to acquire wealth. We hope it's given you a richer, maybe more complex picture of that world. What will you choose to explore next? We'll see you for the next deep dive.